Nothing personal, he said, spinning lazily in his ergonomic chair, like a kid waiting for recess. We just need younger energy, someone who gets the vision. I sat across from him, watching the slow rotation of the chair, the gleam of the skyline behind him, the way his smile was just a fraction too rehearsed. It wasn't the words that caught me. It was the casualness, the way he delivered a death sentence like he was commenting on the weather. My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 42 years old, Senior Vice President of Product Strategy at a company called Nexora Dynamics. 12 years ago, it was just me, my co-founder, and a converted garage in Jersey City with a server rack we kept cool, using 2 rattling window AC units. We built the platform that turned Nexora into a $500 million machine. The core technology, mine. The long-term contracts with Fortune 100 clients, mine. I know because I negotiated them myself. I've run the numbers 100 times. My work is responsible for 79.4% of the company's current value, a percentage that is, ironically, printed in the very quarterly reports the CEO now waves around at investor luncheons. The 29-year-old across from me, Evan Price, wasn't there for any of it. He was still fresh out of grad school, running a podcast about disruptive mindset frameworks when we were coding at 3 a.m. to keep our first client from pulling out. He joined after our Series C, climbed quickly, charmed the board. Now he was here, telling me I no longer fit the vision. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit. You learn a lot in silence. His gaze flickered to his phone just once before he leaned back and said, "You've done amazing work here, Dan. But the market's changing. We need agility." Agility. The word tasted like sawdust. I nodded once, slowly. "Understood," I said. My voice was even, controlled. I reached across the desk, shook his hand, felt the soft grip of someone who'd never had to fight for a contract in a fluorescent-lit conference room at 2 a.m. Then I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. Inside, I was running a catalog. Every time he'd talked over me in a meeting, every pitch he'd rebranded as his own. The board dinners where my chair was suddenly unavailable, so an outside consultant could join instead. I had the timeline, the patterns, the tells. I reached my office and pulled my leather briefcase from under the desk. My team wasn't in yet. Good. I didn't want the looks, the questions. I slid my laptop in, collected a framed photo of my daughter from the shelf, and paused at the sound of the printer down the hall. It was unusual this early. I stepped over and found a sheet sitting in the output tray. Board letterhead. Half shredded, like someone had fed it through and stopped halfway. The text was clipped, but enough was visible. Phase 2. Restructuring. Non-disclosure acquisitions. Removal of legacy constraints. Legacy constraints. That's what they were calling me now. I folded the page, slid it into my briefcase between the laptop and the photo, and finished clearing my desk. The building was still quiet, the glass walls reflecting the morning light. I took one last look at the office I'd worked in for the past 7 years. The view of the river, the faint hum of the servers through the vent, and then walked out without looking back. In the lobby, the security guard glanced up, surprised to see me leaving with my coat over my arm and my briefcase zipped. "Heading out early, Mr. Cole?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. Outside, the air was sharp, the kind that makes your lungs feel too small. I crossed the street to the parking garage, each step steady, measured. I knew where my car was. I knew where I was going. Not home. Home was for people who could still pretend things were fine. I merged onto the expressway and headed east, past the waterfront, past the warehouses, to a strip of industrial space no one ever looked at twice. My office sat between a closed auto shop and a storage rental place. No sign, no windows facing the street, just a steel door with a coded lock. Inside was 12 years of insurance against a day like this. A secure server rack sat in the corner, humming softly. 4 whiteboards lined the far wall, covered in handwriting and printouts, maps of interlocking connections between shell corporations, private equity groups, and names that didn't belong on any public-facing documents. In the center was a desk, plain, functional, with a single high-resolution monitor and a mechanical keyboard. No one at Nexora knew this place existed. Not my team, not the board, not even my co-founder before he passed. I closed the door behind me, set my briefcase on the desk, and took out the folded board memo. I read it again, slower this time, noting the phrases, the euphemisms. Phase 2, restructuring, non-disclosure acquisitions, removal of legacy constraints. There was a pattern here. There was always a pattern. I powered up the monitor, the familiar encrypted login flashing on screen. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before I began typing. If they thought firing me was the end of my story at Nexora Dynamics, they hadn't read the last chapter. I've always played 2 games. The one everyone sees. The team player in the tailored suit, who shows up early to meetings, takes notes, nods at the right times, and pretends to be impressed by whatever buzzword is trending that quarter. And then there's the other game, the ledger. It started as a battered moleskin in my first year, back when Nexora was barely making rent. Now it's an encrypted database buried 3 layers deep behind fake directories, tagged, indexed, and time-stamped. It holds every pattern, every shift in tone, every scrap of evidence that tells me who's really pulling the strings. I powered on the secure server in my off-book office and waited for the hum to level out. The monitor lit, pale blue on black, asking for a key phrase only I knew. My fingers moved from memory, typing the words without looking. The screen blinked green, and the shell interface opened. I navigated to the comms archive, a buried relic from my days as system architect. Every executive had their accounts wiped and cycled quarterly. Every executive except me. I had quietly disabled the purge protocol on my own admin credentials before handing over the reins, disguising them as an inactive training profile no one would question. When the archive loaded, I started with the most recent quarter, filtering by encryption flag. 98% of executive comms were routine, meeting invites, vendor haggling, board updates. But 2 threads stood out. They were short, irregular bursts, heavily encrypted, and carried no subject line. Both originated from Evan Price's account and went to a single recipient identified only as V. I opened the first one. The header alone told me it wasn't company sanctioned. The encryption was commercial grade, not the standard Nexora suite. I ran it through my local decryptor. Nothing. Whoever V was, they weren't using anything off our shelves. I copied the entire block, stored it in a separate folder, and moved on to the next burst. Same pattern, same silence on the other end of my decryptor. V. The letter sat in my head like a splinter. I leaned back, letting my eyes move over the far wall, where the whiteboards were crammed with timelines, names, and corporate shells. My gaze landed on one photo tacked in the corner. Marcus Hale, my mentor, my friend. The man who built Nexora with me from nothing. He'd been the one who convinced me that vision needed structure, that innovation wasn't enough without discipline. 2 years ago, Marcus had been killed in what the police called a cycling accident on a stretch of Palisades Road with no cameras and one witness who didn't see the car clearly. I never bought it. Marcus didn't ride that route. He hated the blind curves. I'd buried the doubt for the sake of sanity. But now, I opened Evan's old calendar logs from that week. There it was. A private block labeled only "Client Dinner" in the same city Marcus had been in, less than 24 hours before the accident. No travel logged before, no expense report filed after, like it never happened. My jaw tightened. I knew I couldn't jump to conclusions, but conclusions were already drawing themselves. I opened a separate terminal and ran a trace on V, using every public and semi-public corporate registry I could reach without triggering alerts. The first lead was dead, a mailbox drop in Nevada. The second was better, a consultancy firm in Luxembourg with exactly one client, dissolved 18 months after formation. That thread linked to a holding group in Singapore, which linked again to an innocuous-sounding import-export business in Miami. That one was active. The Miami entity's history read like a case study in corporate predation. Stake quietly acquired in mid-size firms, key technical staff, restructured out, patents sold overseas within months, brand names stripped and sold to the highest bidder. Same pattern, every time. If they had Nexora in their sights, the process was already moving. The screen in front of me felt colder now. I scrolled through the acquisition targets in their last 3 cases, 2 in biotech, 1 in logistics. Each began with an internal push to modernize leadership. Each ousted their top technical architect, and in each case, the public filings never mentioned the holding group pulling the strings. I leaned forward, fingers tapping out a new query into the comms archive. If V had sent Evan files, even heavily encrypted, metadata might still be there. It was. A cluster of attachments across 3 weeks. I downloaded them to a quarantined folder and set my decryptor to brute force. One file cracked first, not clean, but enough to read. It was a spreadsheet. Title, target list, phase 2, 4 names, mine at the top, 3 others still inside Nexora. Next to each was a single word, remove. The screen's glow painted my hands pale. I stared at my name on that list until the rest of the office blurred away. They hadn't just fired me. They were dismantling everything I'd built, piece by piece. And for the others on that list, the clock had already started. The investor mixer was at a rooftop lounge downtown, all brushed steel and glass, the kind of place where the drinks had names like liquidity event, and everyone smelled faintly of money. I walked in, wearing a tailored navy suit that didn't scream executive, but didn't fade into the background either. That was the point. Tonight, I wasn't Daniel Cole, ousted senior VP of Nexora Dynamics. I was Daniel Price, small-time venture guy out of Boston, with a little dry powder to deploy in promising tech. The alias was thin, but I'd used it before, and it played well with people who wanted to be overheard. The first thing you learn in rooms like this is that everyone's hunting something: capital, credibility, or cover. My job was to be what they thought they were looking for. I spotted 2 Nexora board members by the balcony, laughing too hard at something a third man said before he peeled away. Elizabeth Tran, who chaired the audit committee, and Robert Keene, whose Rolodex could fill 2 floors of an investment bank. I approached from an angle that let them see me coming, not too fast, not too casual. "Robert," I said with practiced warmth, as if we'd met once at a conference. He hesitated for half a second before smiling, shaking my hand. The pause told me he was searching his memory and deciding it was easier to pretend than admit he didn't remember. Elizabeth followed suit, her handshake cool, her eyes already scanning the room. We talked markets first, safe territory. I let them talk about the changing environment and pressure to adapt, nodding like every vague statement was a profound insight. My glass stayed mostly full. Theirs didn't. Alcohol loosens tongues, but so does subtle agreement. When Robert mentioned aggressive leadership realignment, I tilted my head, lowered my voice, and said, "Speaking of leadership changes, interesting move with Cole." That got me two reactions: Elizabeth's jaw tightening just a fraction, and Robert's eyes flicking to her before he said, "The board had discussions. Not everyone agreed on timing." I let that hang there a moment, sipping my drink, making it look like I wasn't about to dive on the opening. Then I leaned in slightly, dropping my shoulders, signaling this was just between us. Timing's everything. Sometimes these decisions feel rushed. Robert didn't answer, but Elizabeth did. Let's just say certain items were expedited. Closed session, no minutes. She caught herself too late, then added quickly, "Standard procedure in sensitive cases." There was a beat of silence. I smiled like she'd just confirmed something trivial, then shifted the topic to broader industry moves. But inside, the picture sharpened. Evan hadn't gotten the full board's blessing. He'd maneuvered it through a private channel, probably with V whispering in his ear. An hour later, I found Robert alone at the bar, staring into his glass like it held the answers. I approached slowly, ordering a drink I wouldn't touch. "Hell of a view up here," I said, nodding toward the skyline. He gave a humorless chuckle. "You'd think it makes everything look smaller. It doesn't." We talked about nothing for a few minutes before he dropped his voice. "You didn't hear this from me. Some of us don't have the luxury of opposing certain moves. Not with the paper we've signed." I kept my expression neutral. "Paper?" "Contractual obligations," he said, rolling the words like they tasted bad. "V's firm doesn't just invest. They structure deals, clauses. If we breach, they don't just come after the company. They come after us. Personally. You know what that means?" I did. It meant bankruptcy, ruin, and a lifetime of being radioactive in the business world. It also meant the board wasn't just complicit. They were trapped. I left the mixer without pushing further. There's a point where more questions close the door. I had enough to know the rot wasn't just in the C-suite. It went deeper, and some of the people I'd called friends were now just liabilities in expensive clothes. Driving back to my hidden office, the betrayal sat heavier than I expected. Evan was predictable, a climber with good hair and better timing. But the board? I'd had them in my home. They'd toasted my wedding. I'd watched their kids grow up in holiday cards. Now I could see the distance in their eyes at the last quarterly meeting. The way they'd stopped looking at me directly when Evan spoke. They weren't selling me out because they wanted to. They were doing it because they'd already been bought. The office was dark when I stepped inside, just the low hum of the server waiting. I hung my jacket, sat at the desk, and pulled up my toolkit. If Robert was telling the truth, the paper trail had to be somewhere, and it wouldn't be on Nexora's public systems. The board used a private cloud service for sensitive files, encrypted, invitation only. 2 years ago, Marcus and I had built the security protocol for it, a system so tight they'd bragged about it to other companies. I'd kept a backdoor key hidden in the code, masked as a checksum routine no one ever questioned. 10 minutes later, I was in. Folders stacked neatly in front of me: audit, compensation, strategic initiatives. The last one was where I found it, a contract labeled Acquisition Terms, Confidential. I opened it and scrolled through page after page of dense legalese, my eyes catching on the parts that mattered. Irrevocable equity transfers, offshore IP assignments, mandatory staff reductions. Then, I hit the timetable. 72 hours. That was all the time left before Nexora's core assets were stripped, patents reassigned, and the shell left to bleed out in the market. The glow of the monitor felt colder now. I sat there in the dark, reading and rereading the dates, the signatures, the seals of people I thought I knew. The company wasn't just under threat. It was already on the slab, and the knife was halfway down. 72 hours. That number sat in my head, like a countdown clock I could hear ticking behind every thought. It wasn't enough time to save everything, but it was just enough to make a choice. Either keep Nexora alive or burn it to the ground before V's people hollowed it out. I wasn't interested in watching them win. The first calls went to people I trusted, the kind who had been in the trenches with me before Evan showed up with his vision. Department heads who still believed in the work, not just the quarterly returns. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't need to. I only asked them to run archival redundancy protocols, our euphemism for pulling full physical backups of the core IP onto drives that never touched the corporate network. I arranged 3 separate drop points. No names, no direct handoffs. If one set got intercepted, the others might survive. Between calls, I worked the systems. Nexora's backbone was still familiar to me. I'd designed it. I embedded deadman switches in key operational code, small, dormant routines that would render our software inoperable if triggered. It was the kind of insurance you hoped you'd never need, but when someone tried to weaponize your life's work, insurance became a necessity. If V's acquisition closed and they moved the IP offshore, I could wipe the functional core before it was fully in their hands. I was careful, but Evan wasn't stupid. By the end of the first day, I noticed discrepancies in the server access logs, entries that didn't match my obfuscation patterns. He'd ordered a full audit. I had to work faster, bouncing my activity through offshore relays in jurisdictions where Nexora's contracts had no legal reach. Every connection added seconds to my operations, but it was better than being pinned. If they traced a single packet back to me before I was ready, the whole play would collapse. On the second night, my burner phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the other end stopped me cold. Dan, it's Alan. Alan Morse had been my right hand in R&D for years, the kind of engineer who could turn an impossible concept into a prototype in 3 days. He'd been quiet since my firing, too quiet. Now I heard why. "You've got to walk away," he said, low and urgent. "These people, they don't just take companies. They make problems disappear." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of the server rack. "Alan, you're telling me you know what's going on." "I'm telling you I've seen enough to know it's not worth your life. They've got resources you can't imagine, legal, political, and not the kind that wears suits." His voice broke slightly, and I could picture him rubbing the bridge of his nose, the way he did when a problem didn't have a clean solution. "Please, I'm saying this as your friend. Just go. Leave the rest to rot." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think I could walk away, let the company die, and keep breathing. But that wasn't how I was wired. The people taking Nexora weren't just after profit. They were building a machine that could gut any company they touched, and no one would be safe once it was perfected. "I can't," I said finally. Alan didn't argue. He just exhaled, long and heavy, and hung up. By the start of the third day, the shape of my move was clear. There was only one way to stop this, and it meant walking straight into their controlled space. The next scheduled board meeting was in 24 hours. If I could drop the evidence there, every encrypted message, every contract, every clause that tied them to V, while the full board was in the room, the fallout would be instant. Regulators would smell blood. Investors would scatter. V wouldn't be able to close without exposure. The risk was obvious. That room was Evan's turf. He controlled the narrative, the agenda, the minutes. But if I could seize the floor long enough to present what I had, the facts would speak louder than his smirk and jargon. And if I failed, well, there were worse ways to go out than taking a shot at the people trying to erase you. I spent the rest of the day consolidating files, triple encrypting the master package, and setting an auto-dump to major financial journalists if I didn't enter a kill code within 4 hours of the meeting's end. My insurance wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about making sure the truth survived, even if I didn't. Just before midnight, I powered down the terminal and leaned back, stretching muscles that hadn't moved in hours. My eyes burned from staring at screens, my thoughts running the angles of tomorrow, over and over. I was about to stand when my phone buzzed on the desk. Not the burner, my real phone. No caller ID, just a text. "We know where you sleep. Walk away." I read it twice, then set the phone face down. The message didn't scare me. It just meant they knew the clock was ticking too, and that I'd chosen the right fight. The boardroom felt colder than I remembered, like the air conditioning had been dialed down, just enough to make people uncomfortable. A long stretch of polished mahogany dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs that had witnessed more betrayals than handshakes. I stepped inside with a slim black briefcase, the kind you could carry into any corporate setting without raising an eyebrow. The carpet muted my steps as I crossed to the far end of the table. No one said anything at first. Most of the board members were already seated, murmuring in low tones, sipping coffee from Nexora-branded porcelain cups. A few looked at me with polite confusion, as if I were an item that had been misplaced and then rediscovered without explanation. Robert Keene's gaze flicked to mine, then away just as quickly. Elizabeth Tran's face stayed locked in a neutral mask. They knew something was coming, even if they didn't know what. The chair at the head of the table remained empty. That was Evan's seat. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind it framed the city skyline, sunlight reflecting off glass towers in sharp white flashes. When Evan finally walked in, he was all easy confidence. Tailored suit, crisp shirt, smile set to maximum charm. He didn't acknowledge me directly. Instead, he greeted the board, thanked them for coming on short notice, and launched into his vision speech. It was the same performance I'd heard before. Bold projections, strategic synergies, and enough jargon to choke a dictionary. He gestured toward the large wall screen as slides clicked by, each one more self-congratulatory than the last. The board listened, some nodding, some pretending to take notes. I waited until he hit his stride, until his voice carried that subtle edge of triumph. That's when I reached into my briefcase. The zipper was silent, but the shift in the room was instant. I pulled out a folder of printed contracts and a stack of decrypted communications, then slid them down the polished table. Pages fanned out in front of the chairwoman, the legal language heavy with words like irrevocable transfer, shell corporation, and offshore assignment. Evan paused mid-sentence. His smile didn't drop, but his eyes sharpened. "Dan," he said, as if he were trying to remember if I was real. I didn't give him the chance to steer the narrative. "These," I said evenly, "are the acquisition terms you've been negotiating through your friend V. And these." I tapped the next stack. are the communications you thought were buried. Before anyone could speak, I pulled a small remote from my pocket and pressed the top button. The wall screen flickered, the slides vanishing, replaced by a cascade of files. Each opened automatically. Records of illegal IP transfers, wire confirmations to accounts in the Caymans, and finally, a dossier on V, real name, criminal background, photographic evidence of meetings with Evan. Gasps broke around the table. One board member muttered something under his breath. I hit the second button on the remote. Somewhere, an encrypted packet of data went live, delivering the same files to a dozen major financial journalists and regulators. I watched the awareness dawn on a few faces as they realized this was no longer containable. Evan's composure fractured. A flush crept up his neck as he stepped forward. "This is out of context." "Sit down," the chairwoman said sharply. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Security had moved to the door, eyes flicking between her and me, but she raised one hand without looking at them. "Let him finish." I met Evan's eyes across the table. "You wanted younger energy," I said quietly, so only he and the nearest board members could hear. "Now you'll have the rest of your life to reflect on it." The silence after that was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of paper as Elizabeth scanned a page from the contract stack. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Robert shifted in his chair, avoiding Evan's gaze entirely. The screen kept cycling through evidence, each image and document a nail in the coffin. Evan opened his mouth again, but the words didn't come. His hand hovered over his phone, like it could undo what had already been unleashed. The chairwoman leaned forward, clasping her hands. "Mr. Price," she said, her tone formal, almost bored, "you'll need to step outside while we deliberate." It wasn't a request. Security moved this time, guiding him toward the door. He didn't look at me as he passed. I gathered the remaining papers, slipping them back into the folder, then closed my briefcase. No one stopped me. The room was already shifting into damage control mode. Phones out, whispered conversations, the quiet panic of people realizing the ground under them had shifted without warning. Outside, the hallway felt brighter, emptier. I kept walking, down the elevator, across the lobby. The city noise hit me like a sudden wave. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and only then pulled out my secondary phone. A single message waited in my dead drop account. Phase 2 terminated. V has gone to ground. I stared at the words for a moment, then locked the phone and started the engine. This wasn't over. But today, Nexora lived, and the board knew exactly who had built it.